Hello and welcome to MultiLateral Thinking, your independent view of global trade trends. My name is Rebecca Harding and I'm the Chief Executive of Coriolis Technologies. The US exports 4 times more semiconductors to China than it imports from them. When the trade conflict between the US and China first started, it was meant to be about the fact that the US had a large deficit with China, and a lot of the conflict was about China buying more US produce. So why on earth, last week, did the US Department of Commerce write to all US chip manufacturers requiring them to get a license if they wanted to sell their technology to SMIC, China's largest semiconductor manufacturer? The move, it seems, was because SMIC's chips and semiconductors were being used in research and development for the Chinese military. The US State Department, by imposing this requirement on US companies, was attempting to stop any transfer of technology into the hands of the Chinese military. Semiconductors themselves aren't necessarily military in purpose, but they can be put into products and they can be put into processes that can be used for military purposes. So they classify as what's called dual-use goods. Dual-use goods are products that can be used for either military or civilian processes. And what we're seeing now in the US-China conflict is an escalation into these types of goods. Now, if you look at the pattern of dual-use goods trade over the last 4 or 5 years, what you can see quite clearly is that between 2013 and 2018, there was growth in dual-use goods. After that, actually, the trade in dual-use goods, particularly in electronics trade, across the world has dropped back. Now, that could be for 2 reasons. The first could be because a lot of research and a lot of work in technology has gone into the cyberspace. So a lot of it is done now in the cloud, and there is less of a requirement for physical hardware. But the second reason might well be because of the changing nature of trade between countries. Now, if you look at the flow between China and the US, for example, it's been declining for a number of years. So there was a growth between 2013 and 2017 in electronics trade as China itself started to be able to grow its own capacity. But since then, the trade in dual-use goods, particularly in the electronics sector between the United States, has dropped back quite considerably. For example, US exports of semiconductors have dropped from over $48 billion in 2013 down to $12.2 billion now. That's a drop of around 71%. So clearly something is going on that's much more than trade in semiconductors. Maybe the issue is not that China is becoming too dependent on US technology, or even that US technology might be used for military purposes in China. Let's look at this the other way round. Maybe the issue is that China is becoming less dependent on the United States, and this in and for itself represents a strategic threat to the United States and its own activities. So if China is becoming more independent, then what it means is it's less reliant on US technologies, it's developing its own technology itself. And if you look at the patterns of trade in China, it certainly bears out that hypothesis that it is becoming less dependent on highly sensitive technologies coming from the United States. Now, what this suggests is that if we've seen this decoupling going on for longer than just the last couple of years, that decoupling is something that is deliberate strategy under President Xi. Indeed, since 2013, Xi's whole national strategy has been to grow China's strength economically from inside as well as in terms of its trade with the outside world. It has developed a strategy which is to grow its own economy, to grow its own demand, and to grow its own self-sufficiently, most importantly of all. What this means is that if the United States is indeed trying to export less to China, De facto, what's happening is that it's allowing China to develop its own technologies itself. So by itself decoupling, it's making China more dependent on itself. As we move into the US election and the last few weeks of the campaigning, we're likely to see more aggression and more rhetoric that's aggressive towards China. Don't expect anything to change because this is something that China has acknowledged. China has acknowledged that the United States is likely to be more isolationist and likely to have a more nationalistic approach to its technologies in the future. As a result, China is itself decoupling from US technology and decoupling from the more Western allies of the United States, particularly Australia and Canada. Its own strategy at the moment looks like it's pivoting more towards Asia and perhaps towards Europe as well. What does this mean for practitioners? Well, from a bank perspective or from a trade perspective, it clearly means that life has become more complicated. The risk of sanctions, the risk of breaching requirements from the US Department of Commerce becomes greater. And what it does is it makes it more difficult to understand the complexity of the risks that are now involved in technology trade. A lot of trade is now going to be moving into cyberspace, into the cloud, and so it's intrinsically less measurable. This makes trade finance across the world more complicated. We're seeing an increase in economic nationalism. This is a new reality of the structures of trade that we're seeing. Don't expect anything to change with the US election because the trend is likely to be very similar, and Joe Biden has taken equally as robust an attitude towards China. We are seeing on both sides greater nationalism, greater economic nationalism, and greater protectionism and self-sufficiency. This is a dangerous time and a big threat to multilateralism itself. Thank you for listening.